Hi, welcome to another lecture for English 1060. What I want to do is give us kind of a brief understanding of what analysis is. And even though you're still making an evaluative argument about high school, you have to analyze the material you get from your interview subjects. And so there's still a huge component of analysis that will have to go into Essay 2 and, of course, Essay 3 and Essay 4. You have to always analyze material. And so analysis, I always say, is a dissection, right? That's what it is. You divide a text, event, whatever you're looking at, into its basic components. So in the academic setting, most analytical papers involve close readings, of literature, film, music, history, theories. Any issue or concept can be analyzed, right? Behaviors, any sort of action, event, occurrence that produces patterns. Because this is what we're looking at. And when, after you've done all the interviews, right, you want to look for the patterns, right? Because that is going to be the basis of your essay, right? What are the patterns? So to analyze something is to ask what that something means. And that's crucial. And I've been, slowly kind of building up to these kind of ideas, even in the homework when, analyzing the videos and analyzing all sorts of ideas. And so an analytical essay always answers how something does what it does and why it is as it is. And that's going to be crucial. The why question is really going to be crucial for essay 2. What factors have led people to their answers? Why do they feel that way? If they feel high school is helpful or hurtful, why? And this is where you could help build your thesis up. So a thesis statement in an analysis paper should be answering a how and why question in a way. So a strong thesis makes a claim about the subject that needs proving. It provides the writer and reader, of course, with a clearly focused lens through which to view the subject. In the case for essay 2, you're going to make a clear evaluation of high school, but you have to base it on the people's responses. You have to base it on the data. So you can't just base it on your personal experience. And so this is when it's kind of a mix of an analytical and evaluative thesis statement. And so what we want to do is just look at really the analytical thesis statement and what it does. So what the purpose is, it's really to explore the reason or the purpose for the way in which a work, idea, or event is constructed. So it investigates, again, the how and why behind the functioning of all components. So go back to the original lecture. I think it was either the first or real lecture that I gave with thesis statements. And so we have this example. The life of a typical UNCP student is characterized by time spent working a job, going to school, and socializing with peers. Right? So what we're doing is we're breaking down the life of a typical UNCP student. Right? That's our thesis here. It's characterized by these three separate points. And so you break that down, and you even further break that down each point, because you're going to have to establish how the typical word is being used, what's the criteria for what a typical person is. Again, it explains, a writer will still need to prove that these three components exist in the life of a typical student, so they have to analyze the three components. And then the writer will also need many concrete examples, and that's kind of key too. Yeah. No, an analytical paper actually, that again, this is a real example from a paper, but an analytical thesis should always just have a singular focus, like anything. If you're going to do a compare and contrast, obviously you may have 2 points, but this is coming from a student paper, so it's not the strongest example. But it again shows the start of a thesis for an analysis, and again, you would be you could still kind of go beyond the 3 points, but you still always want to have a stronger singular focus thesis. Yeah, so that example is not the best example. I'll give you real life examples in a moment. So a weak thesis either makes no claim or is an assertion that really doesn't need proving, right? So it's a fuzzy lens that will not help the reader or writer, of course, be guided to a better understanding of the subject. Most weak thesis statements suffer because they're overly broad or not specific enough. So, just to kind of give you a little formula, right? A weak analytical thesis will have some sort of broad noun, some very weak word like is, right? An evaluative adjective or even vague direct objects. Something like even if you just said, the group the group of students feel that high school was unhelpful, right? Well, okay, that's not really an argument because that's the way they feel, right? You want to use a lot better language. So even look at today, right? If we were saying something like, today's economic situation has many factors. Well, yes, it does. It has many factors, right? You're not actually breaking down the economic situation by saying it has many factors. The lack of detail and specificity makes the thesis statement underdeveloped and really uninteresting, right? Even if you're going to say something like Robert Frost writes about birds. Of course he does, like many poets. So you need an argument. You still need to make a specific argument at what does it mean that he write about birds, right? What is there symbolism that we're working with? Something beyond that. So a strong analytical thesis statement, just to give you a little formula, will have some sort of specific noun, some sort of active verb, and an assertive predicate. Usually that's where you have your reasoning, right? So for example, if I were to say something like this: the tax policies of the current administration reduce the tax burden on the middle class by cutting education and healthcare programs for everyone. Note how there's no real evaluation. What's important, though, from this example is you could kind of tell the biasy or the subjectivity of the author. Obviously, he probably wants these tax policies in place. But if you look at the language, right, the tax policies of the current administration reduce the tax burden on the middle class by cutting education and healthcare programs for everyone. So what we're doing here is we're going to have to analyze that reduction, right? So this thesis has a clear plan of analysis. We will need to analyze the reduction of the tax burden, how it affects and reduces the burden on the middle class, how it affects cutting education and the healthcare programs, right, for everyone. Even though it still has kind of this vague sense that, yeah, this author probably really wants the tax policies in place, the language itself is more analytical than saying these tax policies are great and something like that. So the best way to remedy the problem of overgeneralization is to move towards specificity in word choice, sentence structure, and idea. These are key phrases and words to memorize for any analytical paper, and this will really help your supporting paragraphs for essay 2. Phrases such as in order to, for the purpose of, by, because, which demonstrates that, which reveals, which is significant because, right? All these words and phrases show that you are answering a how and why question. So if let's say everyone that you interviewed for essay 2 said high school is great except we got bullied, right? So that's important, right? So the fact that people got bullied is significant because why, right? What does it reveal about high school? To give you a context, this is another thesis statement about the movie Taken. So, by having the main character, Brian Mills, Liam Neeson, avoid any punishment for killing several dozen people in Taken, Pierre Morel reinforces the cultural assumption that America knows best and should be allowed to police the world without any consequences. A very thick statement, right? Very dense sentence, but it's important to look at this because of the analytical properties here. Notice how the author is not judging whether Taken is good or bad. The author is looking at the meaning behind the character, right? What this author is suggesting is that Brian Mills represents or reinforces the cultural assumption that America knows best. Again, we could kind of see their kind of biasy in a way, but in terms of language, the author is not making any specific evaluation. What this author needs to prove to us, and this is what's very important, especially if you've seen Taken, we could easily argue this, right? We could easily offer a counter argument saying, "Oh no, he represents just a father, right? Or he represents a father protecting a daughter, or he represents the American male, right, or things like that." And so we could really debate this, but this is when we get into a really good point of analysis where we're dealing with argumentation, we're dealing with meaning, and we're dealing with significance, right? Because this person has to prove to us, right, what that cultural assumption is, how it manifests itself in the movie, how that character represents this idea, and of course give us specific examples in the film how he represents this. And so analytical thesis statements are obviously very difficult at times, but what we're really looking at oftentimes is subtext. And subtext is an important concept to help build analytical arguments. So subtext, what it is the underlying meaning behind what is said or written. And again, this is when language, we all instinctively know subtext. In a lot of ways we communicate with subtext often, but when we really think about it on an intellectual level, it shouldn't even make sense. We shouldn't talk about subtext. However, It's implicit or oftentimes a metaphorical meaning. Subtext is a meaning derived from what is not directly stated or presented. Right? We encode subtext in order to understand it. One of the simple examples I could give you is, let's say we were meeting, let's say you wanted to meet with me in my office, right? You came into my office and you say, "Hey, good morning, Dr. Bernson, how are you?" And I just went, "Oh, I'm fine." What do you know? I'm not really fine, right? How do you know? My language, my tone, my intonation, right? Even though I'm saying I'm fine, I'm really meaning that, I'm politely saying, I don't want to discuss whatever I'm feeling right now, right? But instead of saying to you directly, right, "Oh, I just had a terrible night, I'm tired," and all that, I'll just, I'm fine, right? And so that simple phrase all of a sudden becomes a very important, complex idea that you automatically register, and most of us do, right? Not all of us maybe, but most of us would register that, wow, his body language is sunken, his tone is very, soft or low, and so there's something wrong with them. However, because of politeness, we typically don't go much further. But we know these instincts, and a lot of us have better instincts at times, and this is why we want to work to look at our kind of critical thinking skills when it comes to analytical essays. So, in writing or speaking, we find that subtext usually exists through implication. And think about this, right? And depending on your major, you may have heard this in some form or another. Imagine that I said to you, "What could you possibly do with an English degree?" Is this a negative question or is it a positive? So, as we've been discussing, that this question implies that there's an aspect of being an English major that's unhelpful or unproductive or unprofitable or impractical. It's impossible that it's useful, right? And so, what's important about that key word here, possibly, oh, excuse me, it creates this extra meaning, right? That if I just took the word out, what could you do with an English degree? Well, that's kind of a neutral question for information. But once I add that word possibly, we now have the subtext that I, as a speaker, assume that there's actually nothing really useful about it. Let's look at a scene from the War of the Worlds remake. Now, I would argue it's not a great movie. However, this kind of important scene depicts what we also view and encode as subtext. So it's a conversation between the father character, Ray, and the younger daughter character, Rachel. So Ray, here we go, some nice peanut butter sandwiches, right? So we get a shot of Rachel, looks at him spreading the peanut butter sandwiches, obviously making a face, right, to mask frustration. She says immediately, "I'm allergic to peanut butter." Ray is surprised. He keeps on spreading the butter. Ray says, "Since when?" There's a brief pause, and then Rachel says, "Birth." So, again, the subtext, Ray is a terrible father. So, how do we know that? We can determine the subtext by inferring that, of course, a good father would know his daughter's allergies, especially since they were from birth. So his lack of knowledge concerning this fact weakens his position, right, as a father and authority figure, which, plays into his ethos, right? So this is a very interesting kind of concept, and I'll give you an immediate example. One important concept to consider is that the author may be wrong. And this is kind of counterintuitive in a way, but it's important because people are human. We have to remember that. The author is human. The author may be influenced by personal prejudices, cultural biases, traditional or contemporary beliefs. Or, of course, in the case of this ad, someone wasn't really thinking about implications. So, this was a very controversial ad that sparked a lot of anger, hate. A lot of people really got angry about this. And let's look at why. And if you know the real context, which of course the PR people did, right, they weren't thinking about these grander implications. This picture of Coach Grouchy and his son was taken after a victory over Indiana. But of course, the subtext is, kind of too gross to mention, right? Because it just, as Anna pointed out, especially with Penn State right over the shirtless boy, it kind of bespeaks of pedophilia, right? So, who's right? And this is what's important, is obviously this was unintentional, but who is right?